All right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk 96. It's going to be myself, Bob Hayeri, as your host, along with my co-host, JD Moore. We're going to be talking about football in Japan. We're going to have a couple of great guests. I see them already joining up, so I'm going to go ahead and start letting folks up. We're going to be talking international football. So let me say, konnichiwa, bonjour, madame et monsieur, hola, amigos, privyet, marhaba, shalom, buongiorno, hamidi khoshamadit. But Japan's had college football, or actually it's had football, for over 80 years. It's not quite as big as baseball or soccer, but well over 100 college football teams regularly play across several divisions. Plus, there's the X League, and we'll get into that in a moment. You'll occasionally see posts about college games on our CFB, often late at night, and they have a following here. I wouldn't say a huge following, but a significant enough following that they keep pervasively continuing on. And international competitions, Japan always seems to compete well with other football-playing nations like Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Not quite the United States, but that's them's the breaks when you're competing internationally. This is a show I've personally wanted to do for a while. It took a bit to find the ideal guests. The language barrier and culturally there's some shyness about English, and that slowed it down a little bit. But we found not only one, but two ideal guests for a conversation tonight. BJ Beatty grew up in Hawaii, where he was a standout high school player, three-star linebacker, all of that. Went on to Colorado, where he redshirted and played from 2007 to 2010. He found his way to Japan, where he played in the X League for the Obik Seagulls, was an all-X League team member several times. He recently retired from playing. He settled down in Japan with his family, where he also co-hosts the Gridiron Japan show with our other guest, who I'll get to in a second, and Greg James. He recently became an assistant coach at the University of Tokyo, who are the Warriors. And by the way, if you know anything about academics, University of Tokyo it's one of the top schools in the world. John Gunning, well, anyone who follows sumo, as some of us do in the off-season here at our CFB, know his name and know his work. He's one of the leading English language reporters covering the sport. He's a columnist for the Japan Times, commentator on broadcast for NHK and NHK World, as well as contributing to CNN, BBC, HBO, etc. But it's not just sumo. He covers a lot of sports, including football, where he's a part of Inside Sport Japan. He's also sexy, cool, and beloved by all. So, hey, JT, have you had a chance to make it up?
Yes, we are here and very excited to talk to our fantastic guests about college football in Japan. Aloha ahi ahi and aloha kakiaka to you all for this fantastic conversation. Very, very excited to talk to, not only a guy who from Kahuku, I could talk about Hawaii prep football all day long, but especially to be able to talk sumo a little bit with John Gunning. I'm very, very excited for this conversation, but man, I am so amped about this one.
Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, guys. Thanks a million for inviting me. Pleasure to get on and get to talk about football in Japan with an international audience. It's a passion of mine, of course, and don't get to talk about it enough, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. And thanks for putting in the sexy, cool, and beloved by all as well. The checks in the mail.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Excited to talk football. Just in general. Sean said cool and sexy, but in Japan, he's the most interesting man here. Like, honestly, I mean, you guys have. I can give you the player perspective, but John can probably run history of Japan and football more than anyone I know here. So yeah, just excited to get going.
Yeah, I've gone down a rabbit hole over the last few years. Japanese football, as you guys probably know, there isn't a lot of information in English, and there hasn't been historically. So buying old magazines, searching out old programs on eBay and various auction sites, buying stuff, I've been coming across an incredible treasure trove of information and just sharing bits of it as I come across it, games and players and things that happened over the past 80 odd years. And you said earlier in your introduction, there's over 100 teams in Japan. There are actually 205 college teams in Japan. And then there are several like semi-pro leagues. So football here is, if you consider it to be a rabbit hole, I mean, it's one I haven't even close to seeing the end of yet. So there's a lot we can talk about.
Absolutely. And I would love to start the questions off with BJ because, again, you and I shared very similar stomping grounds growing up. So you grew up in Ka'ava, went to Kahuku High. I actually grew up down on the Mackay side of Oahu, probably about equidistance between Kaiser and Kalani High School. So down on that east side of Honolulu. I'm very fascinated with your journey, starting from Kahuku, then you went and you played at Colorado, and then you've gotten now into Japan, not just as a player, but as a coach. I would absolutely love to know where this journey took you to, not just the mainland, but to go into Japan to really find your own calling. What originally drew you to Japan, and what's been keeping you there?
Oh, I mean, we're from Hawaii, right? And just what is the biggest, right, market as far as tourists we get, right, is the Asian market. I grew up thinking so many things we took for, like, I grew up thinking, like, taking your shoes off when you entered your house. I thought that was Hawaiian. I grew up honestly thinking that was like a Hawaiian thing. The Japanese word for octopus, taco, like, there's so much influence, and it was always there. I took Japanese in high school. Actually, not much of it I retained. And the opportunity came through a good family friend who was a former Obic head coach in the 90s, I want to say. Coach David Stan. He also coached at Kamehameha. He was at Kamehameha at the time. And yeah, he came over and I was just recovering. I was trying to rehab through an injury that I was going through. And he asked me, he was like, there's an opportunity to play in Japan. Like, what do you think? And I told him, hell yeah, like, when and where? Like, football is football to me. And, that led to a sit down with, and, and I tell this story, I forgot to say this. I was actually a tour guide at Kualoa Ranch at the time. I was doing ATV tours and I was supposed to go to work that day. And I get the phone call at about 6:30 in the morning from Uncle Dave saying, hey, they're coming over. They'll be here at 9 o'clock. I call into Kualoa Ranch and said, hey, I'm not coming. And they're like, oh, what's wrong? I was like, I got something better to do today. And that's literally that was the excuse I gave my manager. And he was like, that's not good enough. I was like, well, too bad. And had to sit down with the current head coach, Makoto Ohashi, and probably the GOAT of players when it comes to Japan and the X-League, Kevin Jackson, who played at the University of Hawaii. Sat down with them, had a good talk, and they wanted to bring me out a month later. I walked into Kualoa Ranch the next day, said, I'm quitting. And just came over to Japan, and I've had my good moments, I've had my bad moments, and I've just, I want to say I left the game in a better place. And it's just been an exciting, like, I can't even describe. There's not enough time for me to describe just how thankful and just how much it's meant to be able to continue to play this game for as long as I did. You talk about me coming from Kahuku, like, I was a little, I wasn't supposed to go as far as I did in my football career. Let's put it that way. When I first started.
Yeah, and because you come from a family that plays a lot of football. I mean, obviously your father, coach, and also linebacker who played for BYU, and your maternal uncle, first round pick out of Colorado himself, and even was interim coach of the Rainbow Warriors for a few games there after Norm Chow was let go. So you come from a very strong football playing family from Hawaii.
Yeah, but and it's funny that I ended up here in Japan because everybody always talks about how big, like, oh, you're so big, you're so that. And I'm like, I never started out this big. You talk about my dad and my uncle, and they're definitely the reason why I got as far as I did. They helped me with the mentality. They helped me with the skill sets that I needed. I was definitely very lucky in that sense. Yeah, but it was like JD knows, and on our side of the island, like, there's a joke. You could rob on Friday nights if there's a game. You could rob the entire North Shore because no one's home. Like, that's not a joke. That's pretty much, you could pretty much rob us blind because everybody's at the games. But that was also pressure though. My dad, I'm named after my dad. And I actually had Pop Warner coaches tell me, like, how are you your father's son? I've had people tell me that, and it was a decision I had to make at that moment, right? Am I gonna sit in his shadow my whole life, or am I gonna, step out of it? And luckily they pushed me enough to where I did step out of it. And I mean, yeah, it's it is seriously insane that I played as long as I did.
Absolutely. And I mean, you are spot on when you talk about, the split of once you have those night games hitting on the North Shore, everybody is out at a Kahuku game. One of the things that I think not a lot of people realize is, you hear on the mainland, you have the private schools that pump out all this talent. Like you hear stuff about like Marcus Mariota coming from St. Louis, or the Tagovailoa brothers, or all those other guys coming out of those preps like Manti Te'o out of Punahou or something else like that. But Kahuku has been that dominating force in the public sector for so long. I mean, you're talking about, you have, I think it's like 8 current championships right now in Division I and a ton in the Open as well. And that's literally just since '99. You don't even have to go that far to know how culturally significant Kahuku football is to Hawaii, and what kind of pipeline it's churned out with so many NFL players, and what that really means for those guys growing up on the North Shore, what it means to be a Red Raider and to don those colors on a Friday night. I absolutely love the fact that I just get to nerd out about all this type of stuff, but more than I do in the fact that this generates a type of generational expectation, and it creates a generational growth for all these guys who end up donning those Kahuku uniforms. What did that growth at Kahuku bring you for your college football career and ultimately your coaching career?
Well, I found out early, right? So I didn't really know this until maybe a few years ago, but I was the first 3-year starter at Kahuku, and I didn't know that until maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. What that helped me was learn, when I got to Colorado, right? Everybody was player of the year. Everybody was all state. Everybody was all this, all that. And I already had the early experience to, the starter is better than me. The starter is more physically gifted than me. But how am I going to take, he's my teammate, but how am I going to get on the field? How am I going to get my starting role? I had to deal with that already in high school. When I got to Colorado, I had the guy in front of me. He played in the NFL. He's a Super Bowl champion. Brad Jones played for the Packers. I had to kind of like mirror him in a bit, and how he operated, how he watched film, how he did all that. And I used all my experience of having to outwork the guys, outplay the guys, out hustle the guys, and that helped me, get over that hump and get into a starting role at Colorado. And I think just having that, that mentality where I can't settle and things like that is also what helped me play for so long here in Japan.
That makes sense. John, we want to bring you into this as well. And I just wanted to kind of, because we're getting a bit about, obviously, BJ's start, which is more of, somewhat more relatable to our audience, especially in the United States. But, I've always been curious, especially I know high school football isn't necessarily as big in Japan. So is there, for kids growing up there, is there a competition between, I don't know, this is, again, possibly my own ignorance, like sumo or sports like that? Do they tend to attract big men more, or how is that? What sort of explains sort of or not the lack of interest, but how high school doesn't quite have the grasp that it does at the college level?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because when you say it's not big, you're right in the sense that it wouldn't be well known, even among, we'll say, football people in Japan, or especially internationally. But I mean, it's there, and there's definitely a very widespread high school, junior high school, and even elementary school football scene. And as in a lot of other places around the world, of course, flag football is, exploding, growth going through the roof. Japan is a weird country for football, because, like, as you mentioned, Japan has never lost to any country outside of the US or Canada in its entire history, at either club or international level, at senior level. So Japan dominates everywhere else, but still can't beat the States, because obviously the US has, professional football and, many, many times more high-level players than we do here. So it's a really high-level sport, and it's played at a relatively high level all the way through, but it's really hidden. I think we did a conference about 3 or 4 years ago where Nielsen, the big company that does all the research on sport, estimated that American football was the 47th most popular sport in Japan. So it was behind all kinds of things like speed walking and, figure skating and all kinds of stuff that you'd never heard of, like recreational sports. So it's not a sport that's widely known and widely followed, but those that do it at a very high level. And there are structures in place from the early age, and there are high school systems, junior high school systems, tournaments at all levels. And I think that's one of the reasons why the X League, I think it's obviously the major reason why the X League is so strong and Japan is so strong relative to every other non-US country, is because players are brought, a huge percentage of the players who play here come into the sport as kids. So you have people like Aaron Ellis, who is playing quarterback now in the second tier in Japan. And he's saying things like he saw more coverages in his first game in Japan in the second tier among the secondary than he did in 5 years in Europe at all levels, including their highest leagues there. So the football IQ is very, very high here, and the level of the game is played at a very high level, but it's hidden away. So people don't even know about it. So I'm not surprised that you didn't know about the high school football, because even the people who follow football in Japan wouldn't be familiar with that level.
What do you think football in Japan can do to continue to grow? I mean, that's kind of a broad question, but it's something I find interesting too. I think over time it's grown a bit, and even the interest. I know I read an interview with BJ that crowds he noticed over time had grown larger. I mean, we're not talking enormous crowds, but they've gone from, in the hundreds to the thousands, which is an improvement. So what sort of things do you think football can do to grow as a sport within Japan, John?
It's actually gone the other way, to be honest with you. There was a Sports Illustrated podcast recently that did a thing on the football boom in the wake of the Mainichi Star Bowl. I think when the Cardinals and the Chargers came here in '76. So football experienced a really big boom from the 70s to the 90s in Japan. And in the 1990s, it was televised. You had Joe Montana coming over every spring for the preseason spring tournament. He was the face of that tournament. You had large crowds. You would have maybe 20, 30,000 people for games that didn't count for the standings. College football was selling out. And you had a lot of teams that were backed by big financial institutions. A lot of the banks, almost all of the banks that existed at the time, sponsored a football team and, financed them pretty well. And then you had the financial crash at the end of the 1990s, and a lot of those banks pulled out and withdrew sponsorship. Football went off television, and it's a shadow of what it was in the 1990s. As the level, it's this weird inverse curve, whereas the level has continuously and progressively gone up, and the level of Americans and imports who started coming in the early 2000s just went through the roof. I think we had 35 of 37 3 years ago had some kind of NFL experience or came from D1 FBS programs, which is, unheard of in any other semi-pro league around the world. And, just the level of the team, you can see the Japan team is, going toe-to-toe with the Spring League in March 2020. The level has definitely risen continuously, but the popularity and the awareness of the sport, experienced a fairly significant decline from the end of the 90s. As to what it can do, I mean, there are a whole host of things, but like you ask anyone involved in the sport here who is, doesn't have control or doesn't have their hands on the levers of power, it's banging your head against a wall trying to get stuff. There are too many cooks, basically. Too many people who have influence and say, and the game is too fractured without centralized control. But getting the sport on television, capitalizing on the fact that you have U.S. military bases in the country with a large football-loving audience, which is constantly refreshed. Thousands and thousands of U.S. military personnel that you could be bringing to games that aren't even aware that football takes place in Japan. That's an audience that I think absolutely should be exploited, because they're obviously going to cycle back to the US and spread the word. I think you continuously grow your audience there. Getting on TV is still a huge thing, obviously, in Japan. You want to try and get the games in front, but there are a lot of different things. There's a sort of a catch-22 situation where the money isn't there, and without the money, it's hard to grow. But I think a little more centralized management and a little bit better long-term planning. Japan could have a football league. Japan could have, if the investment and the effort was put in, Japan could have a CFL-like league or even a higher-level CFL league, because obviously we have a much bigger population, much larger economy than Canada has. So football in the 1990s was probably bigger than rugby. And now rugby in Japan is massive, and it has, a professional league that pays the highest salaries in the world. So, and also soccer, 1993, they brought in a professional league, and now the J League in Japan attracts great talent, and it's, this huge, probably this almost on a level that baseball is at. So,
it's funny, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I'm talking, I'm wearing a 2019 Rugby World Cup shirt for the All Blacks from when it was in Japan. So I know you've covered that. You've covered that particular World Cup
I was
on
the field for most of those games, including the final, and you see these massive crowds and the worldwide attention. And rugby as a sport is obviously there are more countries where it's at a major level, but the actual overall figures, it's very similar to football on a global level. So Japan could definitely have that kind of thing. We could have a CFL. There could be a third. Well, now obviously with the USFL, there's a third professional league, but there could be a fourth professional league in the world, and it could be in Japan, and it could be the second best one if the effort was put in.
One quick follow up on that last kind of comment about the way the money sort of dipped. Was that tied into the bubble economy? Because I'm old enough to have remembered the roaring Japanese economy of the 1980s and how it just sort of came to a screeching halt, around 91, 92. Because my first visit to Japan was right before that happened. So is that, because when you bring up the banks sponsoring the teams and putting in all the money, and you mentioned the 90s, anyone who knows anything about Japan knows the 90s were a pretty dark time economically, especially for that kind of hubris that we saw in the 80s around the world from the roaring Japanese economy.
Yeah, I would say that obviously the 80s were the bubble period, where people lighting cigars with $100 bills type of situation, or 10,000 yen bills, I should say. But it probably didn't really hit football until the mid-90s. It was still, it wasn't at its peak in the early 90s, but football was still big in the 90s. It was probably the thing that dealt the death blow to it was the 98 financial crash, 97, 98, where the markets collapsed. And so that was the financial crisis that affected the banks in Japan most. And they were obviously the sponsors of the football team. So that was when the sea change took place. And I think it was a gradual decline, as I said, in probably just awareness of the sport in general. So I think if more people knew about the sport, it would be more popular. But it's like rugby as well. There's a hurdle to entry, if you know what I mean. So there are certain sports like soccer that are very simple. It's basically, 11 versus 11 kicking a ball into a net. So there isn't really a lot to learn. Whereas with football and rugby, there is definitely a lot more you need to know to understand what's going on the field. And even still these days at rugby games in Japan or football games in Japan or on commentary on TV, the commentators will explain what penalties are and what they mean. Things that you just don't see in NFL coverage, So you want to get them explaining, a holding means that he held on to the player and didn't let him go, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, there's a barrier to entry, obviously, for new fans, but still I don't think that's big enough to stop the sport becoming as big or bigger than it once was.
John, I'm curious, as you mentioned, these announcers will go into detail about what these penalties are or they aren't. And this is a question for BJ as well. What would be some of those differences that we might see in Japanese football that we would see in perhaps U.S. football? Are we looking at any differences in field dimension, in the way that the game is played? Is there anything structure-wise that is distinctly different in Japanese football than we would see over here in the States?
Well, I'll leave BJ to talk about how the referees deal with stuff on the field, but I'll just say the leagues in Japan basically follow the NCAA rules, so everything is more or less the same, even in the X League, that it would be in college football in Japan, in the US, with the exception maybe of things like, it's much more tightly adjudicated. So even if you spike the ball after a catch, you'll get an unsportsmanlike penalty for that. But yeah, I think that's the key to switch over to BJ, because BJ is the man who knows all about getting flagged on stuff.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, yeah. I was very notorious. I will say this though, I was always described as aggressive. I was never. No one could ever say I was dirty. I will say that. No one could ever claim that. But I mean, just to give you a rundown, my very first game, quarterback, they tried to run a read option out of the pistol, and I completely annihilate the running back. I put my head right in his chest, and his cleats kicked me in the back of my helmet. Flags come flying. So, me being naive, I'm thinking, I'm brand new to Japan. I don't know all this. I've heard that the refs can be, especially particular to the foreigners. And so I'm walking back to the huddle, and I hear my number in Japanese. I didn't really know too much. All I hear was, 23, Niju-san. And I was like, what? On me? And I'm thinking, like, I didn't grab his face mask. I didn't, I was like, what? And KJ was losing it. My head coach was losing it. And I was like, what are you guys mad about? They're like, they just gave you a personal foul. I was like, me? And I was like, yeah, the ref said that your hit was too aggressive.
Oh, my gosh.
That was literally the ref's description. There was no targeting. This was 2012, so there's no targeting yet. There was none targeting yet. And, yeah, that's, and it's actually gotten better. The referees, yeah, they can miss some stuff and things like that. But I will say early in my career, there were some refs that definitely wanted to control the game. Like they wanted you to just know that I run this and everything like that. Like, probably not a well-known one is I got ejected out of the IBM game, and I politely asked the ref. I was like, for what? What was the first penalty on? And he runs up into my face and starts screaming at me. He was like, you know what you did, da 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 da. And I was like, okay. And I turn around and I'm walking through my teammates, and I literally go, I'm sorry for the sensitive listeners, I literally go to, not looking at the ref, I'm just looking, like thinking to myself, I go, what the fuck? And he throws another flag.
Oh.
And his explanation was like, BJ just told me, fuck you. And I looked at him like, no, you did not. And I got ejected out of the game for that. And my head coach was, trying to debate for me and stuff like that. And, the ref was like, no, he's gone. And then I did something that kind of got me in trouble, which is, why I had a reputation with the refs. But some refs loved me and stuff like that. I get to talk to them now that I'm at the University of Tokyo. I talk to them before games and stuff like that. A lot of them are great guys, but that one ref in particular, I don't know. I don't know what I did to him. But I remember before I left the stadium, I was like, I didn't say fuck you then, but I will say it now. So this whole stadium knows I did it, and I did it in front of the whole team. And the best part was my teammates were laughing.
Yeah, I remember, because in your own words, you had a reputation as being like a bad man of the league. And is it just because of the aggressive play and kind of confusing sort of, folks in Japan who assumed you were like that all the time?
Oh yeah. I mean, I was, JD talked about it. I was raised to play this game one way. And in Japan, when I first got here, like that wasn't, now, and like, I don't want to say I was the guy. I want to say I kind of had a hand in influence in it. Like, you watch the X League now. Heck, you watch the college kids. I see some college kids now, and like, they get up and they pump their chest, they pound their chest. They're doing all the, the cool dances now and things like that, flexing. I see all of it now, and I'm just like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to play aggressive. Play within the rules, obviously. Don't play dirty, but play aggressive. Like, that's what the greatest part about this sport. When I first got out here, like, so I played IBM for the first time, and Kevin Kraft was the quarterback for them. He was lighting up the league, and I sacked him. And I remember I got in his face just because I wanted to be in his head, and I got in his face and I told him, you better get comfortable because I'm going to be in your face all day. My own teammate told me, we don't do that. You don't do that. And I looked at my teammate, was like, no, this is how I play. So you better get used to it. Like, I'm not. This is how you play football. So, that was some of the challenges I had to deal early on with, just having to navigate that road.
Excellent. I'm just going to do a quick station ID. This is our CFB Talk 96. We're talking football in Japan with BJ Beatty and John Gunning. We had a couple of callers. I wanted to allow one, at least mix in a few. Wondertaker, you've been really patient. What's up?
Hey, thanks for bringing me on. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Great. First off, I wanted to ask John, where are you from?
I think, well, he's Irish.
Oh, okay.
I could say that much.
He's from Ireland originally.
Oh,
yeah.
Moved over here to do sumo. Oh, here he is.
That's great.
I can't hear anything. Is somebody saying something?
He asked you where you're from originally.
Really? You can hear? I can't hear this. Yeah, I'm from Ireland originally. Lived in the States and Italy before, but I've been in Japan for 22 years now at this stage.
That's great. I love the game going global, so that's why I'm so interested in the conversation tonight. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm from Oregon, and we've had a long tradition, at least.
If somebody's speaking, I can't hear anything right now.
Just one.
Oh, that's so weird. Well, we can hear it, John. I'll tell you what, Wondertaker, just go ahead and I'll convey the question. It won't be a problem. I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. I was just going to say I'm from Oregon, and we have a team, a small town here called Ashland, and they have a long tradition of playing Japanese all-star teams back and forth over in Japan, over in Ashland. I don't think they do it anymore, but they started doing it in the 80s. And so I was wondering, first off, what is the high school situation like in Japan? How are they feeding the college programs over there to obviously get better and better?
Oh, that's a good question. And I can convey that to you, John, if you didn't hear it. So I've heard about this, our guest, he's from Oregon, and he mentioned that Ashland has that high school kind of game where they play with Japanese all-stars on a regular basis. I know that's been for a number of years now. And there was kind of a question, and we sort of touched on this earlier, on how there's that kind of build up to build teams like that. And in Japan, those kinds of that high school development that goes towards it, because he's familiar with those teams that would play Ashland.
Okay. So that game actually started, I think that was Chuck Mills, was it?
I think so, because I was thinking of Chuck as well, because Chuck brought the first American football team to Japan with Utah State. And then obviously he settled in for some of his career, and he recently passed. He's an admirable guy in every sense. But yeah, he was coaching, I think, for Southern Oregon.
That's right, Southern Oregon Raiders. I think KG Fighters went to Oregon and played the Southern Oregon Raiders in 1985. I think they were an NAIA team at that time. And after that, they had... That kind of morphed then into the Pacific Rim Bowl.
Yeah,
that's called, right. Where you had like high school teams coming. But even up to recently, you have the U.S. military high schools dotted around the Pacific, Guam, Saipan, Korea, places like that. So there are tournaments where they play sort of all-star games against Japanese high school teams as well. That's played pre-COVID. That was played up to, I think the last one was like 2019, maybe. I mean, even you had the former Prime Minister of Japan at that game at one of the military bases here. But yeah, so there is definitely, the high school and the college level, the teams have probably had more outreach. Well, obviously, they had, like a little bit like the football in the US, the college game was big here long before the pro game or the semi-pro game as it is became popular. So they've had links going back to 1934, basically with foreign teams. And yeah, Japanese colleges and schools have played. Obviously, KG Fighters is probably the one that's best known, the most successful college program here. They've played in Mexico. They've played against Princeton twice. They played against Southern Oregon. They've been fairly proactive about playing teams from other countries. And a lot of the high school, there's obviously the International Bowl and stuff like that. So at the underage level, there are definitely more international links and games going on. Because obviously at that level, the differences aren't as pronounced. You don't it's not like the NFL versus the X League, which wouldn't happen under any circumstances. So.
Hey, thanks for the question, though. We appreciate it, and thanks for listening.
Okay.
So, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question just on the X League structure. Also, I know college does this too, because there's promotion and relegation in those leagues, isn't there?
There is promotion and relegation at all levels of football, pretty much outside of the US. So in Europe and in Japan, you have two big systems, right, in sport. I mean, obviously a lot of people will know this, but just to go through them. So the US has basically what is a kind of communist kind of system where it's a closed loop and all the money is shared between all of the teams and there's no promotion or relegation. So that's what the NFL uses. That's what major American sports use. They use a franchise system where everyone is sharing the same pot. Whereas in Europe and in Japan and other countries, it's basically like complete free marketism. So basically, the teams with the most money in soccer or whatever can just buy all the best players. That's why you would have leagues like Scotland, where only two teams have won over the last 100 years, essentially. Or like, Spain, where you have Real Madrid and Barcelona, and that's basically it. So in American football, in Europe and in Japan, it's more or less the same kind of system with probably... because there isn't as much money, you don't have the pronounced differences. But there's promotion and relegation. So the bottom teams in the top division will face the top teams in the second tier, and then second tier, third tier, fourth tier, depending on how many divisions your league has. In the X League, there are 4 divisions. So basically that's the way it works. So in this year's system, the way they've set it up to 12 teams in the top division, the bottom 4 will play off, and the 2 losers from those games will then have to face the top 2 teams from the second tier to see if they can hold their place. And the winners of those games will get to go into the top division or stay in the top division. And then, it's the same in college football. The bottom team usually in each division plays off against the top one in the lower division. So you can have a lot of movement. You can have teams that are powerhouses or that did very well. I mean, we were just talking about it recently. Club Bears in the 1990s was a team that was, facing off against the top teams in Japan, going toe-to-toe with Panasonic. And now they're 4 divisions lower down, and they barely have, enough players to get onto the field at any one time. So, fortunes rise and fall, definitely, in football. And it's interesting to see how teams manage that, because there isn't the safety net. There isn't the safety net that you'll always be in the top division that exists in American sports.
I found that fascinating because I've been, following college football at the very least in Japan for about 5-7 years or so. And you'll see there'll be teams that kind of hover on that level of they'll be Division I, they'll lose. And of course, as you point out, and that's the part I always get a kick out of, it's not automatic promotion relegation. It's like, okay, if you have an off year, you're the bottom of Division I or Division II. You have to then play the top team from Division II or Division III. But if you manage to beat them, you stay in your division. But then...
Sorry, that's sometimes I should have probably said this, that it depends on the system. Sometimes you will have situations where the very bottom team will be automatically relegated, but the second team then will go into the playoffs. So you do occasionally have situations where the very bottom team is punished by just being dropped down automatically. But it's more common for there to be a playoff. So the playoff system kind of ensures that you don't have a team that's doing really well in the second tier, but is just not good enough to survive in the top division, actually ends up in that division.
Absolutely. I wanted to just kind of steer back to you, BJ, for a second, because you have first-person experience in this. How does the import player system work in the X League?
I mean, a lot of it is kind of word of mouth. Not word of mouth, or just kind of, the connections that you have and things like that. I think now, when I first got out there, I think teams are starting to go search. Early on, there was a lot of Hawaii guys, a lot of West Coast guys, because I think teams were thinking guys don't want to come from too far. Where now you look across, right, there's guys from the South, there's guys from the East Coast. So, Ian's listening and he's from, the Northeast and things like that. And, you're getting guys from that side. And I think now the search is going nationwide. It's always interesting, though, how guys come across. Like, myself, I knew somebody who used to coach here. I just sat down with Ian. Ian sent out a email to Lixo thinking he wasn't going to get an answer back, and he gets an answer back. Guys, some teams have held like combines, at high schools back in the States. I've known that. And it's just, there's all kinds of ways that people find the X League and they find themselves here in Japan.
How many import players are each team allowed? Is it 4?
So you're allowed 4, and only 2 can be on the field at the same time. Some teams you'll see like Panasonic, right, where there's guys who played in the States, but they're on the field all at the same time. Those guys are so there's 2 ways to kind of loophole it. You have a Japan passport, so you were born here. So some of the guys are born here, or one of their parents are a Japanese national and they have their Japan passport. Or like my younger brother, who I played with at Obik, he went to Nichidai, which is a college. It's one of they're struggling this year, but it was one of the top college programs. He went there, graduated. He could play, and he wouldn't count as a foreigner, at least as far as on the field. So there was kind of ways to loophole that. But yeah, you're allowed 4 slots, and usually teams go 2 offense, 2 defense.
I know that typically you're going to probably recruit out of a prospecting base that's in the United States. But do we see any other foreign nationals, like maybe pulling out of Canadian leagues or Mexican leagues or other Asian market at all for these import players?
I think this year we had the first one, right, John? He came from England, right? Who played with Ian. He plays with Ian.
So, yeah, you're talking about Joe Morton, right? So Joe Morton came from a British academy. He's Scottish-Serbian heritage. He played for, I think it's in Bristol. There's an academy, a football academy there. There are 40 import players, not counting, like as BJ said, anyone who's graduated from a Japanese university who has Japanese nationality. They don't count. So just Americans with no connection to Japan or Japanese football, there are 40 in the X League. 39 of them are American. 1 guy is Scottish-Serbian. He's not the first ever non-American. We had Jared Stegman, who was Australia's quarterback. He played here for a while. And in some of the lower divisions as well, you'll have guys we talked to, Colton Runyon. Actually, no, he's American as well. But there are a few like British guys or people trying out at the lower divisions. But at the top division, of the 40 that are there currently, I just have the stats here in front of me, 15 of them, 38%, have some kind of NFL experience, either off-season games or spent time with an NFL team in mini camp or in training camp. 7 of them have, which is 18% of CFL experience. And if you're talking about college football, so of the 40 players who are here this year, 22 of them are D1 FBS, that's 55%. Another 18% is D1 FCS. And then you have very, very few from the lower divisions, 6 from D2, 2 from D3, and 2 from NAIA. So almost to a man over the last few years. I think it's changed a little bit because of COVID and financial situations, but essentially up to about 2019, if you didn't have some kind of NFL experience, if you hadn't spent time with an NFL team, or you didn't come from a big D1 FBS program, it was very hard to even get an answer from a Japanese team because there are only 4 slots, 2 on the field at the same time, and there are so few football opportunities for guys coming out of D1 FBS schools, especially pre-USFL or XFL. I mean, you're either in the NFL or the CFL or that's it. You're not really getting paid. So the X League was hugely attractive, and so they had their pick and choice, essentially, of players. One thing to note is if you played in an NFL regular season game, you're ineligible for the X League because then you're considered a full professional. So you can only play up to the 4th preseason game. If you're on a game day roster, you can't join. So yesterday we talked to Toshiki Sato, who's the Toronto Argonauts. Myself and BJ were talking to him on the Gridiron Japan podcast. He's the backup kicker for the Toronto Argonauts, and he was saying that they should really change that rule for the CFL. So it would be good if they brought in more Canadians, or the X League and the CFL linked up more and had some more player swaps going that way. I think it would benefit both leagues. But yeah, still essentially, we get contacted all the time, daily, by people saying, I lit it up when I was in high school. I haven't played for 10 years, but, I would destroy those guys. And you're like, no, you wouldn't, man. There are people here that have played at Michigan, that have played at UCLA, Georgia, and there's, Devin Gardner, who everyone probably knows, he's just won an Emmy Award this year. He's, hosting a lot of, primetime college football stuff in the US. He was quarterback for Michigan. He has spent time with the Steelers and with the Patriots. When he was in Japan, I mean, he didn't have a lot of help around him, but his last game, I think BJ's team picked him off 6 times in the playoffs. So, you're talking
7.
Was it 7? I thought it was
7.
6. Really?
I got the 7th one.
Well, 6 only counted in the stats, so I mean, there you go. They're putting you down again, man. But what I did,
he was too aggressive. He was too aggressive with the interception. It didn't count.
He picked the ball off too quickly.
Sorry.
The
I'm
whole
glad
point
Gardner
I'm just
didn't
trying
have
to make.
Help.
Yeah. Well, no, he didn't. But I mean, you're talking about a guy
he was really freaking good. I'm glad he didn't have an O-line that could protect him. I'm glad he didn't really have the weapons, because if he did, he would have been a problem. Like, the dude was good, and like John was saying, to get a guy, it was an arms race at one point. It was an arms race. I mean, you had Gardner, you had Kobe Cameron come in, it was insane at one point. It was, and it was cutthroat too. There were
guys
coming in 1 year, they don't win, gone. There's guys who've been on a team for 5 years. They have one bad game, team cuts them, go find their replacement. Like, it was, I want to say from 2015 to 2019, it was an arms race, and it's kind of slowed down. And I think COVID played in that, but it was an insane rotating door at one point.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I noticed that, for example, someone like Woozy from Hawaii, he came over and then he was on a team, and then I was reading like he'd swapped X-League teams, and the article I read said he was cut by the other team. I'm like, wow, that was fast after like a season. So is that part of that? Because I mean, you remember that quarterback, don't you, JD? He was he was in Hawaii for years and years.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, again, to see kind of that opportunity for him as well, I think that really kind of speaks to the key that John had spoken earlier of, everybody would assume that if you're playing overseas, you kind of just assume like, oh, these were people who like couldn't cut it in an American league or something else like that. But in reality, these are talented people who are coming out and playing at a very high level in Japan as well. And I think that's been one of the fascinating things for me to see, not just guys like BJ who, are able to find their own identity there, but all of these other guys who also find their own success in Japan as well. It's been for quite a long time a fantastic place to watch football. And I know, we've advertised it several times, 3, 4, 5 a.m. in the morning Eastern time over here in the States. But that is just one of several examples of the kind of talent that you get to see in this type of league. And I've absolutely loved being able to watch that.
There was a Harvard running back who was doing really well in Japan. Who was that?
Gino Gordon. He's still doing really well in Japan. He's retired now, but he's in the business world. He's doing really, really well. He's very successful, and he still has a lot of connections to the football here. He's brought in players and stuff like that. But yeah, so like you said, Ikaika Woosley was actually on BJ's team. They were on Obic together, and BJ was just talking about guys coming in. So they had Jerry Neuheisel, who's now UCLA's receiver coach. He was a quarterback at UCLA. Then they went to Ikaika, who was from Hawaii. Then they had Skylar Howard, who was at West Virginia. He was their quarterback. Then Jimmy Lockray, who was at Boise State. And now they have a wide receiver at quarterback now. They have Jason Smith from Auburn, right? He was like the wide receiver at Auburn. So they're playing. So, but, that's the level of player that we're talking about. And that's the level of player that teams are, cycling through and cutting. So, yeah, it's a pretty high. And a lot of the Japanese guys, your tweet that went viral this week about the Kyoto Gangsters, everyone was going crazy about the name. Machino, who is an offensive lineman for that college team, the Kyoto Gangsters, is now with Winnipeg Blue Bombers. He's one of their offensive linemen. I think actually he started this week, maybe. So there's a lot of Japanese talent at a high level too.
Human.
Yeah, he's huge.
Machino is a monster of a human.
I have to admit, I've always wondered how, John, and maybe you relate to this, how a guy like Hakuho, I mean, he's Mongolian, granted, but I mean, how he would do if he decided one day, I mean, he's probably past that age where he'd be able to do it, but imagine if he decided to become a football player. That guy is like an all super, I mean, he could have probably done any sport he wanted to do. He's just a natural freak.
So I've talked an awful lot over the years about football and sumo. Obviously, they're my two main passions along with the rugby, but I've taken NFL players. You know, I took Uchin Anwere, who was with the Jags for, you know, a decade or so. Tutan Reyes as well, who was an offensive lineman in the NFL for a decade for Houston and the Jaguars and a few other teams. The two of them were here a few years ago, and we went into sumo stable and they were practicing. And my experience has always been, especially in Europe as well, or the guys who play amateur football in Europe also do sumo. Sumo and the offensive line play in football is very, very similar. A lot of the same principles apply, a lot of the same techniques apply. It's essentially run blocking, where you're just moving an opponent from point A to point B against his will, as they say. So the NFL guys that I've taken into sumo stables that have jumped in and messed around in the ring, they say, oh yeah, this is all of the same stuff. The only things that are really different is that you keep your feet flat in sumo rather than being up on your toes, because you don't have to run down the field or anything like that. So someone like Hakuho, or, you know, some of these guys who've dominated in sumo, I think if they went into football at a young enough age, they could probably succeed. But the only difference is that football, the biggest obstacle, I think, for transitioning is the mental side of it. You know, you have Hidetora Hanada, who is like one of the best prospects in sumo in the collegiate level in Japan, who's just given up that sport to try and make it in the NFL. But, you know, you look at how many D1 FBS players who are extremely high-level football players never make it in the NFL. How many make it for 1 year and are gone? So the opportunities to play professional football are so few and far between, and the number of players who've been doing it since they were able to walk is just, you know, many, many times more than could actually ever find a place. You know, look how many players are cut from the NFL every offseason. And most of those guys would dominate everywhere else in the world. So the difference between sumo and football is the number of people doing it at a really high level. So even though somebody like Hakuho, I think, if he started football from a very young age, he obviously has the drive and the athletic traits to succeed. But whether he would succeed is harder to say, because there are people of a similar talent level in football who never make it. It's just, it's you know, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, right? Isn't that the way it goes in the high school and college and NFL? So
and again, it's sometimes even that work ethic too. You know, I do recall, I remember Jeff Collins, before he went to Georgia Tech, he was at Temple, who came over to Japan to teach, I think, a clinic. And obviously Temple University has a full campus in Japan as well, which also is funny. I'm surprised they don't have a team. That would have been kind of fitting, you know, the Temple Owls of Japan. That would have been amazing. But I know he went to a basho, and he was tweeting from there like, oh my gosh, these guys are like perfect linemen, when he was watching them in their stances getting ready to hit each other. So that was one of those moments I do recall from that kind of crossover between the two.
Yeah, interior offensive line and sumo, I mean, essentially, if you took off the helmets and you took off the pads, it'd be almost indistinguishable. You know, what they do is the same thing, more or less.
You know, BJ, I have a quick question, because you also, while you were a player, you were doing some coaching, correct?
I helped out 1 year at Nichidai with my brother. Never really did it here and there, but I didn't really do it full on as I am now.
You know, what led you? But actually, there's a good fork there, because I'm going to go towards the brother, because your younger brother, Bronson, played DB, and except he joined you, I know, with Obik for a while, you know, but the thing that struck me is he actually moved to Japan to study at a Japanese university, an exceptional one for football, Nihon Phoenix. He was on that championship team, wasn't he?
Yep. Yeah. If they didn't win that game, I think KG, the college that John was talking about earlier, I think they'd
Oh,
be
yeah.
on like a 8-peat right now.
Yeah, they're an incredible organization.
And actually, my baby brother is actually playing for Nichidai as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's an O lineman.
Oh my
So
gosh.
with three brothers, you have a D lineman, linebacker guy. That was me. My middle brother, who's a DB, and then the baby's an O lineman.
I didn't know your youngest was there. That's amazing. So they don't count as import players then, if they were to go.
Yeah. So at the college level, that rule doesn't. There's no rule on that. The college kids, the players are the players. There's no like, oh, he's American, he's Japanese.
Oh no, I meant, but if he graduates from those schools,
So when he graduates, he could go onto a roster and he wouldn't count. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh my gosh. So kind of obviously they won the title, and there's a thing, and I know they finally changed it. And this is one of those quirks that, most people who know football history, and I'm sure John's obviously one of them, historically in the United States, there was the Chicago All-Star game, which was canceled in the 70s because it got out of control. But it was a all-star college football team would play the Lombardi Trophy winner from the NFL. So the NFL champ against an all-star team. It was competitive until the 70s, and then it got way out of control because the NFL finally just got too good. And even in Canada, like the Grey Cup was originally open to any team. And so like the University of Toronto won the first few Grey Cups. So the Rice Bowl, which was Japan's sort of title game, was the X-League champ against the college champ. Now, I know you've played in that, BJ, on the X-League side, and your brother also played on the college side. What was that like to participate in for you?
So my first 2 years, I went back to back into the Rice Bowl. My first year, I really didn't know what to expect. It was a funny lead up because we were playing X League teams throughout the whole season, and my team is like, "Oh, we're gonna win this game. Oh, we're gonna win this game." We get to the Rice Bowl, and we're getting ready for these college kids. From the coaching staff down, the whole team was nervous, and I'm like, these are little kids. We're playing against little kids, guys. Like, what are you afraid of? And the crazy thing is, my first year, we actually had to come back and win. We had to come back. We scored with like so many seconds left and won that game. And then I think going into our next year, like leading up to that game, first team meeting, we're getting ready for that game. Another guy from Hawaii, Frank Fernandez, who's an O-line for us, gets in front of the whole team and cusses the whole team out. And was like, they're little kids. What are you worried about? They're little boys. We're going to run them over. That's what we're going to do. And from that game on, like outside, I think of Panasonic and Ritsu Mankan, the game was never close again. And I think the gap really started to open up. And at one point, that game became like dangerous for me, not just for me, but like going against these kids. Like, I'm not going to go out there and half-ass it because these kids are coming at me full speed, and like, and so in 2020 was the last one. And I mean, I hit a kid and I didn't even give him my all. And he went out with a concussion. And like, it was just like, why the hell are we still doing this? From my brother's perspective, I remember him coming up to me after the game. He goes, holy shit, that was crazy.
Yeah, because it was the Fujitsu Frontiers that year, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's when they were rolling too. And he was like, well, we're going to go out here and get our asses kicked, but we're going to go out here. So,
hey, John, what's your perspective on this? Because obviously from a historical perspective, it was kind of a fascinating quirk to have the college champ play the X-League champ.
Yeah, football here kind of mirrors football in the US, but just maybe decades or a century later. So we had the same thing, right? Before the birth of pro football, it was all about the college game, and it wasn't really till Red Grange and the Bears did their 1926 barnstorming tour that pro football really took off, and then gradually, as you guys said, like they were still able to play competitive games against college teams for decades even after that. So it wasn't really until the modern NFL after the merger that NFL teams pulled away from college teams and from CFL teams. I mean, they were still playing CFL teams. I think the Bears or played the Argonauts even in the 70s, maybe 60s, 70s. I think that was the last CFL, NFL joined games. But yeah, here BJ called it an arms race from 2015 to 2019. So I would say probably maybe 2012 that started. But over that previous decade, the X-League teams have gradually gotten bigger and stronger and faster. They brought in better Americans. Their one significant improvement, obviously, is the coaches. Fujitsu's entire American coaching staff is filled with guys who played and coached in the NFL and, FBS, the old World League of American Football, things like that. So the weight room methods and systems, the coaching, the nutrition, everything has improved. Even though it's a semi-pro league and you still have players only basically training or playing at the weekends, a lot more has been done day to day. And you can see the power and speed and strength and ability of the X-League teams has just improved year on year. And the college teams were already kind of maxed out in that way because, they're doing it every single day and they have 6-hour practices. And that's the way it's been for decades for them. So they didn't really have space to grow or improve. They were already at they were dominating the X-League teams or, the predecessor to the X-League for decades. They were winning a lot of the Rice Bowls. They were better teams on average. But once the X-League sort of kicked into high gear over the past decade, yeah, those games went the same way as the college pro games in the States went. It just became a blowout that was less and less interesting and more dangerous for the young. So you'd have, an 18-year-old freshman who'd only taken up football maybe 6 months before and was skinny kid, and he's going up against a guy who was, come from an NFL training camp, a month earlier. So it just, the danger of injury, serious injury just became too great. So, I think it was the right move. It's obviously, there's a little bit of sadness that unique aspect of Japanese football where you had, the Chiefs versus Alabama kind of game, that kind of stuff is no longer there. It's a little bit, obviously it's sad, but for the game of football and for the players involved, it was the right move. And they kept the Rice Bowl. The interesting thing was they dumped the X-League Championship game, which was the Japan X Bowl held in December, and they kept the Rice Bowl, which is always held on the 3rd of January, and just changed that into the X-League Championship game. So rather than that being the college versus X-League champion game, it just became the X-League Championship game. And now the college season ends in December at the Koshien Bowl, which is their national championship.
Right, in the Koshien Stadium, the famous baseball stadium where the Hanshin Tigers play. And, of course, the equivalent of the Little League or high school championship. That's it. Sorry, that's the big tournament. John, BJ, I want to respect your time. I mean, we could still keep going, but we've been going for an hour. I know, you guys have work. It's morning over there. It's about 10:30 a.m.
I'm good for I have nothing on this morning. I cleared my schedule for this, so just, and I'm Irish, so talking is in my DNA anyway, so...
That's probably where I get it from. Yeah, I'm good too. My wife took my son to daycare, so she cleared the house out.
Oh yeah, you've got how many children do you have, BJ?
I have 3. I have 2 girls and 1 boy, and unfortunately, the boy takes after me.
Oh, unfortunately, that's cool. That's so cute. I love it. That's great. We talked a bit about it because, it's so funny, BJ, you're used to now playing there. And when you said, I knew what you meant when you were referring to IBM. But, of course, the IBM Big Blue, it's one of the other X-League teams. And that's one of the things OBIC is an information technology company. Are all the X-League teams named after companies, or are there some that are organized differently? And I kind of always wondered, do you guys have to work for the company at all? Did you have to do systems integration? But or how does that work?
Before BJ jumps in with what it was like at OBIC, I should probably clarify that. So the way the X League works right now, there are 2 types of teams. There are corporate teams and there are club teams. So even though almost every team has a sponsor, a lot of those are just sponsors that are paying for the team, but they're not actually teams of those companies. So Fujitsu Frontiers and Panasonic Impulse, which are the 2 strongest teams in, the world, basically outside of North America, they are company teams. So everyone who plays for those teams is an employee of either Fujitsu or Panasonic, and they work in the human resources department, or the Japanese players work in all the different areas. The same for all Mitsubishi Lions. The players there all work for various parts of the Mitsubishi conglomerate. But most of the other teams are club teams. So even with IBM is a club team, OBIC as well. So their sponsor is IBM. OBIC is sponsoring Seagulls, but a lot of the players on those teams have no connection to those companies. So how much they actually do for OBIC, BJ can tell you, but with some of the other companies, there's no connection at all between the player's work life and the actual sponsor company. And that's the way the reason that the two corporate teams are so powerful is because of their own status as company teams, because they give their players basically Wednesday to practice as well. So most teams have 2 days a week to practice, but Fujitsu and Panasonic have 3 days a week to practice, which gives them, 50% more practice time. And, you can see that in the results.
Yeah. So at OBIC, so it was so OBIC was the main sponsor. What we did a lot for was another company, kind of like a, what would you call it? I don't know the term for it. I'm sorry, but it's part of OBIC, but just in a lower branch. But we would
like
do
a subsidiary.
Yeah. So that's the word. Yeah. We would do a lot of stuff for them. There was, the company was doing a lot of things back when the tourism was high and things like that, all pre-COVID. We'd go to what was that one? We went to like a ninja park one day. We did like the samurai thing and kind of just gave like what we thought, what people would enjoy. And then on the other side, during the weekdays, we'd do a lot of flag football. So I'd go to like some elementaries just way out in the middle of nowhere and teach these kids flag football. And, it goes back to, the very first time, I'm telling the kid, yeah, just run a toss. And the kid looked at me sideways like, what? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm in another country. You have no idea what this sport is. You have no idea the terminology. And I'm like, okay. So those were the things that we were trying to do, help promote the game, and then also bring in fans and, kind of invite them to come watch and all that.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Talking about what BJ was talking about, teaching the kids terminology or just football in general, I find it the easiest way to teach somebody that doesn't know anything about football is to start off with down and distance. As soon as they can understand down and distance, they can pretty much understand anything that you teach them about football at that point, once they understand down and distance, because that is, from what I've seen, the toughest thing to really wrap your head around is, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why doesn't this happen? It's just easier for somebody that doesn't know football to learn. Once they learn down and distance and the clock, it's a lot simpler to teach somebody what is going on and what to do, and they can wrap their minds around it a lot easier, I think.
Yeah, that definitely
that makes sense. Yeah. I like
that.
Hey,
so one of the teams that I found fascinating, and this was years ago that the New York Times did a feature on them, but the Tokyo Police have a team in the X League, don't they? Or at least they sponsor one made up of cops.
No, they're not. They're not just normal patrolmen. These guys are like SWAT. These guys aren't just. Yeah, I played these guys.
Yeah, because they made it up to the top league, didn't they?
They used to be. So the X League used to be put in a different way, where there was actually 18 teams, and there was one year where the Keisho Eagles, they actually got up there, and we played them in a spring game. And no, they weren't, football skill wise, they weren't all that. But let me tell you, I got hit with a judo toss by hey, John, your speaker's on.
Sorry.
No, you're good. But
so you got hit by a judo toss.
Man, their left tackle like literally swept my leg out and threw me over his shoulder and like hit me with the ippon. Like he slammed me. And I looked at him and I was like, yo, you can't do that. And he was like, sorry. He literally told me, he's like, my instincts kicked in. And I was like, yeah, you definitely shouldn't be out here. You could kill me. Like, I mean, they're good guys and stuff like that. But when I found out, like we were like, what? We're gonna go play some police officers. I thought like longest yard and things like that. I was kind of laughing. My dad's a police officer back in Honolulu, and I kind of like, hey, dad, I'm about to go beat up on some cops. And he kind of texted back like, they're gonna kick your ass. He wasn't lying.
So I should probably add in as well, if you've got any anime fans or people who like Ghost in the Shell, if you know Ghost in the Shell, so that that anime was centered around a fictional police department called Section 9, the mobile riot armored police. But actually the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Eagles are the Section 9 department. So they're the Ghost in the Shell anime is modeled around that police department. So they're the ones that BJ is actually playing football against.
I should ask, just because whenever sometimes we'd either tweet about it or a post would appear on Reddit about college football in Japan, people who tend to know, manga and anime would mention Eyeshield 21. Are either of you familiar with that, or is it?
Yep. I watch it on Netflix. Yeah, I mean it's it's funny though. Like it's pretty long too. It's a pretty long series, but like the one thing I love watching about sports anime, right, is they make it very over the top dramatic, and then some of the skills that like these guys can do, it's kind of like, dang, I wish I could play football like that. But no, it's a pretty good anime, and yeah, if I wish it would help blow this thing up more here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I get a kick out of using some of those some clips I'll make of that, especially that I think it's like the QB with the machine gun, which is just so weird, but it's delightful and it gets people's attention when we want to draw some attention to what's going on the Japanese game. I wanted to also just kind of follow up again. So your brothers both came here, or here being Japan, to study. How much influence did you have in that?
So with Bronson, I'm the big brother, right? And I've always been the one that kind of wants to look out for them and take care of them and things like that. Bronson, unfortunately, wasn't able to go to the Division I like I was. Talented, but his focuses were otherwhere, and his school scores weren't all that great. And he was at home really doing nothing. And I had a conversation with one of my coaches at Obek. Hey, Nichidai is looking for a DB. Do you know one? And I was like, my little brother. And that's how that conversation came along. And with my baby brother, he went to Adams State for one semester. And,
oh, sure.
Yeah, and it's a college in America, right, is tough, and it was in a scholarship. Like I was very lucky to get everything fully paid for. My mom and dad do the best they can. We're not poor, but to pay the tuition, right, that's a stretch for my parents. Where the tuition here at Nichidai is nowhere near what he would pay. And so that was kind of where that opportunity opened up. And I went, it was a different coaching staff from when my brother Bronson was there. But I went over to the coaching staff and was like, hey, could my brother come here? Is that an opportunity? And they were like, yeah, And it wasn't me telling them, come here. It's like, look, it's an opportunity for you to go to school. It's an opportunity for you to still play football. And it's an opportunity for who knows what. I was like, football is the tool. I was like, football is not the end game. Use football to get to where you want to go. So that was it was their choice at the end. I just kind of was like, what do you think about this? And not so much like, no, you're going to go to Japan. I didn't have that. So I didn't want to do that to them.
So I know you've decided to enter the coaching ranks yourself at the University of Tokyo. What led to that decision?
That was a blessing. You talked about Ikaika earlier getting cut from Obik, and sadly I joined that group. And it wasn't something I was planning on. And I was kind of in a well, I'm done playing because I didn't want to play for anybody else. I wanted to go out with my teammates, and because I was planning to retire at the end of this year anyway. However the season played out, I just wanted to go one last round with my guys, and that didn't happen. And so I just reached out to I in 2020, actually a couple kids from the University of Tokyo reached out to me on Instagram, and they're like, "Hey BJ, would you mind like helping us?" And I was like, well, with everything, right? I was like, yeah, like let's meet on Zoom, let's go over film, let's break down some stuff. And I built a connection there. One of the, what would you call him? He was kind of a GA for us at Obit, and he was from the University of Tokyo. He's one of those kids I helped. And I just reached out to him. I was like, hey, would you think Mori-san would let me come on and coach? And like, I kid you not, I think within like an hour, I got a message back. He was like, yeah, here's his phone number, here's his email. And at the time I was actually talking to Kyoto too. I was talking to their GM, Miwa-san, and he was trying to figure some things out with right now with Japan and COVID. The school didn't want me coming from the Tokyo area down to Kyoto, just with everything with COVID still. And so I sat down with Mori-san, and I had a resume ready. I had my philosophies ready. I give my D lineman tests after every game for our next opponent. I had that already, and he said, I don't want to see any of it. And he said, I just want to know where your head and where your heart's at. And I mean, that's how that led. I mean, I knew I always wanted to coach. The games taught me so much, and I just want to give that back. So that's how that all happened. And yeah, it's been an up and down. It's been a learning process at the University of Tokyo. So
that's fascinating. How are college programs organized in Japan?
That all depends on the program. At the University of Tokyo, we're lucky. So our head coach, our DC, and our OC are full-time. So comparatively, we have a lot more coaches at practice than some other colleges. There's also a lot of student, what would you call them? They'd be kind of like fifth-year seniors or grad students who are also out there helping and aiding. And like, there's so much staff. And as far as coaches, though, I mean, having the big three, right? Having your big three there are huge. And it's structured. I mean, they obviously can't be everywhere. So we don't have individual coaches there at every practice. I am only going there on Saturday and Sundays. I meet virtually with them Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays.
So are the players like, is it like, I mean, because obviously we know how American athletics tend to be organized, especially, for example, at, the NCAA or NAIA level. Are the programs there more like super duper clubs, or are they more formally integrated into the university?
Oh, no. They're all part of the school. So, I mean, I have, sometimes I won't have kids at practice because they have class. And obviously, right at the end, so at the University of Tokyo, there's one field that we all really have to share. And we have to share it with the soccer team and the lacrosse team, both male and female lacrosse teams, both male and female soccer teams. So sometimes our practice schedule might fall on the same time as a kid's class or something. He might have something. So yeah, that's one of the challenges. But I mean, there's a lot of people out there, a lot more than you would think. Staff, people with the cameras. There's another interesting thing is, so at the University of Tokyo, we can't really recruit kids. So we're not getting these kids, funneled into us from college. Just to make it simple. So my 4 freshmen, 2 were ping pong players, 1 was a swimmer, and 1 was a rugby player. So,
and these are D linemen,
and they're gonna be D linemen.
Mm-hmm.
And so the freshmen actually don't practice with us because a lot of these kids are learning the game for the first time. They actually have a separate practice, and there's freshman coaches, and those coaches are getting these kids right on their fundamentals and just learning, right? Like, I took one weekend where I literally took all four of them and just taught them a 3-point stance and helped to balance them out and just put them in the right position just to start, right? Because if your stance is bad before the play, there's very low percentage of you likely to do well on that. And so, yeah, that's one of the other challenges at the University of Tokyo is, I have a lot of these kids my seniors only started playing football 4 years ago. So, and how good they are for within those 4 years is amazing.
Mm-hmm. So for a team like KG, down in Kobe, do they just have like a good, because I know there's like a high school team that's got a similar name. Is that how they do it? Are they just sort of teams that are like funneling?
Yep, that's a factory. So there are some colleges. I know Nichidai has one, Hosei has one, Waseda has one, where they have a high school team that does funnel the kids into their college program. Sometimes the kids are obviously, right, they go to different programs and things like that. But yeah, KG's a factory. I mean, they're pumping kids left and right. And yeah, I mean, some of the colleges they're lucky enough to have those high school programs that run up into their college programs as well.
Yeah, I remember Westside had a guy from Chico, California, who ended up going through there, and I think he joined the X League at one point, but that was a while ago. Yeah, no, man, that's fascinating to hear that, especially because there's like two major conferences from what I understand. The Kanto, which is obviously the Tokyo, Yokohama region, and the Kansai, and I'm probably mangling it, which is, Kyoto, Kobe, Osaka area, and then the rest. Because it's funny when you see that tournament that erupts. It's like basically a bunch of Goliaths wrecking little teams, and it's those two teams that end up playing. Or at least I think Kansai has like an at-large bid for the other, for the runner-up. So it really, there's a lot of teams that play, but it seems like there's like 16 teams that are really good at college football in Japan, from what I've observed.
So they have changed the system from this year. So essentially, it's every conference champion will go into a direct knockout for that. So in the previous years, if you finished first, second, or third in Kansai, you would end up in that sort of national playoff championship and the top two teams from Kanto area. So you could probably say the Kansai one is essentially the SEC of Japan. And the Kanto one, which is based around Tokyo, is probably like the Big Ten or something like that. That's probably the closest way you could do it. But then you have a whole host of other, Mid-Atlantic Conference and stuff like that. So basically what you have is you have the winner of every conference just goes into a straight knockout tournament. But the winners of the Kanto and Kansai, so what I said were like the SEC and the Big Ten, they go straight into the semifinal. So all the teams will play off then, and then they will end up playing the two winners in the semifinal. And obviously they're going to lose to them because no other team from any other conference has ever made it to a Koshien Bowl, and this is the 77th year. So the power difference is even more dramatic in Japan. Basically, the two urban areas, the one centered around Tokyo and the one centered around the Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe area, which is Kansai, they are the two centers of power in Japan. The Tokyo one is probably better at the X League level. That's where most of the strong teams are. But at the collegiate level, the Kansai area is absolutely dominant. And so the way things stand right now, before that tournament even gets underway, you still have all the conferences running their own tournaments. The Kanto one, it's going into like the second group stage, but the way it's set up, BJ's team, Tokyo University, still has an outside chance, but essentially you have Waseda Big Bears and Hosei Orange, which are the two teams that finished their original groups unbeaten. They would have to lose all of their games and then tie with each other for another team to actually qualify. So essentially one of those two teams is going to end up in the Koshien Bowl this year. And then from Kansai, you have KG Fighters, who obviously are, the dominant power in Japan, and Ritsumeikan, who's always been like number two to them, and Kansai Kazu's one of the teams that you featured in your viral tweet.
Yeah.
One of those three, probably KG, but I think the Kaisers are looking really good this year. They might actually make it back. They haven't won. They've only won two titles. I think 47 in 2009. So they're angling for a third one this year. They're looking good. But you're probably one of those three teams versus either Waseda or Jose is going to be your Koshien Bowl final this year. And as with the X League, a lot of the games are fairly predictable in advance. So.
You know, guys, I'm going to go ahead and slowly start wrapping it up because I feel bad that we've kept you guys on for an hour and a half. This has been a really interesting conversation. But before we do, I'd love to hear from both of you. Where can we find your work? Where can we find you on social media, your writings? I know, for example, BJ, by the way, I just watched Playing for Sushi. I think I watched the first episode, I guess episode 0 on YouTube that the X Leagues produced with you. And I enjoyed that a lot, by the way. But tell our listeners where they can find you guys and, wherever. John, please go ahead. We'd love to hear from you.
So you can find me sumo-wise, the Japan Times. I have a weekly column there, Inside Sumo, which is online every Wednesday night in Japan. NHK, which is the national TV station, would be like the ABC, NBC kind of thing of Japan. I do a lot of stuff there on the Sumo, the live broadcasts. NBC, NHK World, we do preview shows. You can find stuff on that as well. Inside Sport Japan, the media company I set up. If you're interested in sumo, gridiron, and rugby, we cover those 3 sports. Probably though, for your listeners and viewers in the States, there's a lot of stuff coming up on Apple TV. I've been doing a lot of stuff with Apple, various shows that are due to come out starting probably in January, and there's some major new series that I still can't talk about because I have NDAs on them. Sport-related shows that should be the next version of The Last Dance, shall we say. That might be coming out next year on Apple TV in the US, so you should see me on that.
And BJ, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, you can find me here on Twitter. I come on here every now and then and just have some fun with it. So if you want to follow any of the stuff I'm doing on football, I coach at University of Tokyo, and I actually hold my own. I'm actually having one later tonight. I do defensive line clinics as well, and I don't care whatever high school, college, X League team you go to. But if you want to follow that Instagram, it's BJ_Beatty23, and then also my other Instagram. My personal one, my family, me being a goofball and stuff with my kids, my wife, is Buffalo Soja, Soja. Long story on that nickname. And then, yeah, I mean, you talked about the show for YouTube, Playing for Sushi. It's something I'm excited to start to be a part of. It's not an opportunity I thought that would ever exist for me. And I'm glad the X League has entrusted me with it. Honored, not excited, and just kind of honored.
For those unfamiliar, what's the show about? What the web series?
Yeah, so because we talk about it in the next episode. In episode 1, I'll talk about it. But the way the title came up, sorry, I want to put this out there is I'm sure if you don't know, there's a book called Playing for Pizza by John Grisham, and I was told to read that book when I first came over to Japan, but it's helped me kind of navigate things. But the series is going to be about just the players, the American players, and the experiences that they've had in Japan. Just kind of giving, more in-depth look of the things that they've their lives, kind of where they started, how they got to Japan, talking about where they see Japan football right now. And then even talking about things that could help improve the game, where they see things that would need to happen to help the game grow. And, it's where I'm aiming to just try and help bring more English into the X League. I know I've talked about even bringing English commentary in broadcasting, baby steps and things like that. I'm trying my best because I think, like me and John have talked about, the X League has so much potential. I think there is a good product here. It's just we need to show it and market it more to guys like you guys, people listening here. I think people would enjoy seeing the quality of football that is played here.
Absolutely. Obviously the X League is a whole level above, but even watching some of the Division 1 Kansai games, they're entertaining. And I'm always wondering, like, what on earth? Why doesn't ESPN just pay a small license fee and just throw those on in the middle of the night? Because it's not like they're playing anything on ESPNU at 2 a.m. You know, get some folks who are, you know, either really up late at night or, you know, getting really into it, or up super early in the morning watching some of that. And, you know, hey, this is fun. This is football. And hey, it's live.
And also, you know, one of the things about it is you have, if people, you can see Ian Park is here. You know, Ian spent time with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was at Northwestern. We talked earlier about Devin Gardner. You know, there are guys who would be very, very well known to college football fans in the US that are still playing. And in a lot of cases, they don't realize that these guys that they followed in college are still actually playing in Japan. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in the States that would be interested in seeing how their careers are going as they continue it. So, yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, Ian, some other guys who are here as well, you could have them on in the future as well. And it would be good to spread the word and get, you know, get past that barrier that's always existed with the language with football in Japan.
Absolutely. We'd love to do that. And we'd love to be part of that. I think that's important. And before I also forget, I wanted to mention, neither of you mentioned Gridiron Japan. That was the whole.
I was about to say something. I know Greg's been listening. So, yeah, I mean, we have a podcast with one of the listeners right now with Greg James, John. John is always busy, man, but, you know, he's always making time to talk with us. And we have our podcast that's going, and we talk about the football, and you know, it's the perfect blend because Greg is like the football historian in all aspects. John's the football historian and just overall knowledge here in Japan. And then I'm kind of like the player that gives the X's and O's and the spicy takes every now and then, huh, John?
I'm the person who talks about it, but you're the person who's actually done it. That's the difference.
Yeah, but, you know, we have some fun with it. And, you know, I gave a spicy take this week, and you know, we'll see how it goes. I've gotten some interesting messages about it afterwards, but they got to prove it to me otherwise. So,
yeah,
that's a good blend. That's a good trio.
It's been good having BJ in the media world. You know, he's especially as he said he got cut, so that gives him plenty of motivation to to lay into people left, right, and center. Not that he needed it anyway. He's not a guy who needs much encouragement when it gets time to speak the truth or speak his mind. So it's been really refreshing to have BJ come on and actually tell it how it is. So you got to appreciate the fact that he's in the media world now.
I know we do. This has been a great conversation. Well, John and BJ, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a great talk.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we'll try to work it again some other time. Maybe in the off season, we'll have another repeat, or maybe even before, I don't know, the Rice Bowl or something. That'll be real fun to get back together and talk and see how things are going. Well, that's all the time we have right now. This was our CFB Talk 96. We talked about Japan's football scene with BJ Beatty and John Gunning. On behalf of myself, Bob Akayeri, on behalf of my co-host, JD Moore, thank you all for joining us. Have a great night now, or a great morning if you're over in Japan. Now, I'm going to hang up and listen.